engbreaking.com. Lesson 1. Introducing yourself. Present tense. Questions and answers. Jane is a Yank. Is Jane British or American? American. Jane is a Yank. She's an American. Is she an Australian? No, she isn't an Australian. Jane is a Yank. She is an American. Who is a Yank? Jane. Jane is a Yank. She is an American. Jane is sitting in the restaurant alone. Is Jane sitting with a friend? No, she isn't. Jane is sitting in a restaurant alone. Who is Jane sitting with? She's sitting with no one. Jane is sitting in the restaurant alone. Is Jane sitting in a hotel? No, Jane is sitting in the restaurant. Jane has just arrived in Vietnam. Has Jane lived in Vietnam for 6 months? No, Jane hasn't lived in Vietnam for 6 months. She has just arrived in Vietnam. Where has she just arrived? Vietnam. She has just arrived in Vietnam. Has she just left Vietnam? No, she hasn't left Vietnam. She has just arrived in Vietnam. She walks to a restaurant. Who walks to a restaurant? Jane. Jane walks to a restaurant. Where does she walk to? A restaurant. Jane walks to a restaurant. Does she walk to a cinema? No, she doesn't walk to a cinema. Jane walks to a restaurant. Does Jane walk to a restaurant? Yes, Jane walks to a restaurant. She walks to a restaurant. Does Jane take a taxi to a museum? No, Jane doesn't take a taxi to a museum. She walks to a restaurant. She knows no one in Vietnam and is sitting by herself. Does Jane have many friends in Vietnam? No, Jane doesn't have many friends in Vietnam. She knows no one in Vietnam. How many people does Jane know in Vietnam? None. She knows no one in Vietnam. Why is Jane sitting alone? Because she knows no one in Vietnam. Jane is sitting alone because she knows no one in Vietnam. Jane is feeling a little lonely because she knows no one and has no friends in Vietnam. Why is Jane feeling lonely? Jane is feeling lonely because she knows no one and has no friends in Vietnam. Is Jane feeling lonely because she has no job? No, Jane isn't feeling lonely because she has no job. Jane is feeling lonely because she knows no one and has no friends in Vietnam. Does Jane have any friends in Vietnam? No, she doesn't have any friends in Vietnam. She knows no one and has no friends in Vietnam. Quan walks in, orders his food, and sits at the table next to Jane's. Does Quan sit outside the restaurant at a table? No, he sits at the table next to Jane's. Does Quan walk out of the restaurant? No, he doesn't walk out of the restaurant. He walks in, orders his food, and sits at the table next to Jane's. Where does Quan sit in the restaurant? At the table next to Jane. He sits at the table next to Jane's and begins a conversation with Jane. He begins a conversation with Jane. Who begins a conversation with Jane? Quan. Quan starts a conversation with Jane. Quan begins to talk to her. Does he finish a conversation with Jane? No, Quan doesn't finish his conversation with Jane. He begins to talk to Jane. What does Quan begin with Jane? A conversation. Quan starts talking to Jane. He starts a conversation with her. Quan asks Jane questions to get to know her better. Does Quan ask Jane questions to hire her for a job? No, Quan doesn't ask Jane questions to hire her for a job. Quan asks Jane questions to get to know her better. Does Quan tell Jane a story to amuse Jane? No, Quan doesn't tell Jane a story to amuse Jane. Quan asks Jane questions to get to know her better. Jane tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam. Does Jane refuse to talk to Quan? No, Jane doesn't refuse to talk to Quan. Jane tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam. What does Jane tell Quan? Her story and why she is in Vietnam. Jane tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam. Does Jane sing songs to Quan? No, Jane doesn't sing songs to Quan. Jane tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam. She tells Quan her story and why she is in Vietnam.